Bob Herbert's OpEd.tv is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation with the support of Ann Ulnick. Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. More and more people are speaking out about the increasingly dangerous threat the Republican Party poses to democracy in America. Among the latest to raise the alarm is a wide-ranging group of eminent scholars who have signed a statement of concern that asserts clearly and unequivocally that our entire democracy is now at risk. More than 100 men and women who have long studied and in some cases personally witnessed the tragic breakdown of democratic governments in various parts of the world have signed the statement. One of them is my guest, Jacob Hacker, a political science professor at Yale University. He's the author, with Paul Pierson, of Let Them Eat Tweets, How the Right Rules in an Age of Extreme Inequality. Professor, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Bob.
So can you go through some of the things that have occurred and in fact are still occurring that have brought us to what seems like a dire threat to American democracy?
Yeah, so this statement, which was signed by more than 100 scholars and was put together by Lee Drutman of the New America Foundation, is really an expression of something that I wouldn't have believed was possible 20 or 30 years ago. Namely, that we are following a path that other countries that have experienced democratic backsliding of the sort that we're experiencing have followed. And you know what I thought was most striking, and as you noted, was that a lot of the signatories to this statement were people who study comparative politics and who have seen authoritarian regimes arise in other countries and are worried that we're following the same path. And they're a really wide-ranging bunch of scholars. They include, Larry Diamond of the Hoover Institution, who is very concerned about Chinese authoritarianism and, free market advocate. So this is a very, I think, important statement of two realities. One is that, as the statement points out, we're seeing the same kinds of things play out that we've seen in other countries that have seen democracy crumble. And second, that this is really being driven by the radicalization of the Republican Party in particular. It's not a story of a kind of, bipartisan retreat from democracy. It's not even a story of the gradual erosion of democratic institutions, although we have seen a gradual erosion of our democratic institutions. It's a story of a very specific threat that's emerged, particularly since the rise of Donald Trump in 2016. To our democratic institutions that's posed by the Republican Party.
So I'd like to go through some of the things that are happening that I see as very alarming. And even though they're getting a fair amount of media coverage, I think it's not, in my opinion, getting the kind of coverage that it should get. And what I'm talking about are things like the voter suppression, which has it's been going on for a while, but it's been intensified obviously lately. The extreme gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is something that's been with us almost since the beginning of the republic, but now that's been pushed to real extremes, and a number of other things. So can you talk about a few of those things and what's alarming you most about them?
Yeah, it's worth noting that these are all things that have been part of American politics in the past. But first, we thought that we had vanquished many of them, right? We thought that extreme voter suppression was dealt with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Right. We thought that the kind of extreme partisan gerrymandering that we see would be partly dealt with by the shift away from the shift towards one person, one vote standards in the 1960s. And the other big change, so this is a reemergence of threats to democracy or compromises of democracy that we've seen in the past. But it's a very concentrated effort by one party that is in a position, and this is quite important, in a position to implement this agenda at the state level in particular. So I think there are three core threats. One is what you said before, a return to a kind of, voter suppression tactics that we have not seen since before the Voting Rights Act.
Right.
This is really intensified in the 2010 redistricting cycle. And now we're seeing it play out with Republicans in control of a lot of states in response to the next redistricting cycle, which of course is in the wake of the 2020 census. So, and what happens with extreme partisan gerrymandering is that you get parties and politicians choosing essentially their voters rather than voters choosing their politicians.
Right.
And it means that there's these very protected seats for Republicans, and they have a very good chance of picking up a majority in state legislators or in congressional delegations, even when they don't get a majority of the vote or they get a very slim majority of the vote. And that, of course, increases their ability to do such stuff in the future. So there's voter suppression, extreme gerrymandering, and there's a third development that I think is relatively new, and that's the rewriting of election laws to put partisan political officials in charge of deciding who won elections. And, we might think in another year, that's not a big deal. But
it sounds like that can't be true, actually, when you hear it.
Yeah, no, it really is striking that our electoral system, which is so decentralized and relies on the states, has resisted these kinds of efforts for the most part in the past. This was always a vulnerability, but no party either had a free enough hand or was willing to break enough norms to do what it's doing now. But the Republican Party has clearly been, this is something, as I said, that goes back at least to 2010, but it's clearly been intensified, and the party has been radicalized in the wake of the 2020 election. Again, this is happening in the states that Republicans control, but since Republicans actually have a pretty strong hand at the state level, and particularly in some key battleground states like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, that's where we're seeing a lot of these, Arizona, that's where we're seeing a lot of these efforts.
And this is what Donald Trump wanted to happen after the presidential election. And he was pushing state elected officials, Republican secretaries of state, for example, essentially to either not certify the election results, in which he lost to Joe Biden, or in some cases to actually overturn the results where Biden won, and he wanted them overturned so that it would be declared that Trump won. I mean, it's almost like we're in Neverland. I need an editor to stand by to make sure that I'm not misstating what's going on. So, we've seen many frightening moments during the Trump presidency, and it only accelerated at the end. But if, as you guys contend, and as I believe, democracy is at such serious risk in the United States, and there's a danger, of course, that the Republicans, because it's such a polarized country, there's a danger the Republicans could take control of Congress in next year, and also the presidency again in 2024. What happens if we actually lose our democracy in America? Do we slip into, what is it, authoritarianism? Is it fascism? Is it a kind of technocratic form of government? What do you imagine would happen?
I don't think if Donald Trump is still associated with the Republican Party, it's going to look very technocratic.
I agree.
I think it's very, very bad, whatever it ends up looking like. And I think there are two pathways to this outcome. And to be clear, I think we've often thought of democracy as a kind of on-off switch, and we know when it's on and we know when it's off. But the countries that have seen democratic backsliding are countries that continue to have some trappings of democratic systems, but there just wasn't effective partisan contestation, right? So Viktor Orban in Hungary basically has rigged the game so he can stay in power indefinitely.
Right.
But there's still elections, there's still some kinds of party competition. And that's the more common pattern. Democracy, as one of the signatories said, Steve Levitsky has written, democracy ends not with a bang, but with a whimper. And it kind of, it erodes and becomes kind of a semblance of democracy rather than a vigorous partisan contest. The great democratic theorist and political scientist Adam Jaworski said that democracy is a system in which parties lose elections, right? So it's really important, right, that there is a prospect that the parties in power will lose elections. And right now there's that prospect clearly for the Democratic Party. As you said, midterm elections tend to go against the party of the White House. Republicans are very close in the House. So it could well be, yes, that Republicans will control the House after the 2022 midterm election. What's frightening isn't this prospect of a shift, but that Republicans will essentially gain a power that cannot be challenged,
Right.
effectively challenged. So I said there are two paths. Path one is what I would just call, it's the minoritarian threat. It's sort of an intense version of what we have today, where there's a lot of biases in the system in favor of Republicans. They can basically stop anything they want, even when they don't have power because of the power of the Republican Party in the Senate, and the power of the Republican Party or conservatives in the Supreme Court. So that's the kind of minoritarian route. Republicans, don't get a majority of the popular vote in presidential elections. In fact, right, as you know, they haven't won a majority of the popular vote in presidential elections since George W. Bush's reelection, right, in 2004. And frighteningly, right, they've twice gained the presidency despite losing the popular vote in recent years, and because of the Electoral College. So that's the minoritarian threat. But it could be an authoritarian threat. That's the second route, right? So it could be that these minority advantages allow the party to undermine the checks on executive authority, and a new Republican president, whether it's Donald Trump or another would-be authoritarian, amasses more power, and the Republicans essentially do what they tried to do. Some of them tried to do in 2020, which was to keep Donald Trump in power, despite the fact that he'd lost the election. I mean, we shouldn't forget that the vast majority of the Republicans in the House voted essentially to decertify elections that everyone acknowledged were free and fair, because of the fact that they may not have believed they could keep Donald Trump in power, but they certainly believed that they had to look like they believed they wanted to keep Donald Trump in power to maintain support of Republican voters and of Donald Trump.
One of the things that I think we benefited from was that Trump was just so inept or incompetent. So, for example, the Republicans should have won both of those seats in Georgia in the Senate race, and Trump, with his shenanigans, basically fouled that whole thing up for the GOP. Thank goodness. But you've made the point that we are by no means helpless in the face of these threats. So can you talk a little bit about first some of the efforts that are already underway to fend off these challenges to American democracy?
Yeah, I mean, we've been lucky, partly because the Trump presidency had such catastrophic elements, particularly the response to COVID-19.
Right.
I think there's a very good argument to be made that Trump could have won the election under different circumstances if he'd handled the COVID-19 crisis much more adeptly.
Right.
Likewise, all of that and the Trump efforts around the election, right, led to those two Georgia seats that give Democrats the narrowest of margins to do something. And the reason I say that is those who believe in democracy have to be more than lucky. They have to be smart, right? There is a very narrow window here, because as I said, democracy dies generally with a whimper, not a bang, not with tanks arriving at outside the Capitol, but with a party and authoritarian-minded leaders seizing power in ways that can't be challenged. And so the real opportunity to do something is now. There is a Democrat in the White House who is committed to reform, and there is Democrats in the House and the Senate who have put forth proposals for reform. So you're probably aware there's the number one piece of legislation, HR 1 and S1 in the House and the Senate, is a major political reform bill. There's also the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which is a specific piece of legislation targeted on election reform. Part of the reason why these two things are separate is that there was a hope that, you know, some Democrats who might not be persuaded to vote for the full package would vote at least for voting rights reform, the kinds of voting rights that were won by the hard work of men and women like John Lewis, right? And restoring an operating voting rights law would be an enormous step, but we're going to need also some of the reforms that are in HR 1 and S1, like reform of the gerrymandering process, as you mentioned, having neutral election administration, having basic federal standards for voter certification, and so on, right? So the challenge, as you know, is that we're not going to get any Republican support for these measures, right? I mean, this is a partisan fight because one party is trying to undermine democracy. The other party is going to have to be the one that carries the banner of reform. It's also challenging because of the Senate being tilted in favor of the Republicans. And so Democrats would need to get 60 votes because of the nature of HR 1 and S1 and the voting rights laws. They can't be done through that fast track budget process. They have to be done through the normal legislative process in the Senate. So you need to get 60 votes. It's not realistic to expect that you can get any Republicans on board. So it's the only way this stuff gets passed is if the filibuster is if not eliminated, at least its sway is reduced enough to get this through with 50 votes. And even that may not be enough, because we know that more moderate Democratic senators like Joe Manchin are very ambivalent, if not hostile, to many of these provisions.
Some of these terms are losing their traditional meaning, like moderate, for example.
I'm trying to come up with a new term, but right now they're just the problematic senators, right? They just call them the problematic senators because essentially they're the gatekeepers for whether anything will happen. And so I'm deeply worried about the situation we face, which is why I signed the petition that we discussed.
Could you talk a little bit about gerrymandering? And this is the way the party in power at the state level, every 10 years after the census, gets to draw the district lines, and this determines where people are and who represents them in terms of the House of Representatives and in terms of state legislatures and that sort of thing. And as we've mentioned, traditionally, you know, parties have used the gerrymander to their benefit when they're in power. Republicans, and especially in this age of computers, have raised this to a fine and, in my view, an evil art. But how should these districts be drawn? Is there a way to do it that's nonpartisan? And I would assume we should be able to use computers to make the drawing of lines more fair. But how should it be done?
Well, it definitely can be done in a nonpartisan way. We see that in the number of states who have it should be noted, are states that Democrats win, that the states that have a nonpartisan redistricting process, whether it's a commission or some other set of procedures that essentially allow both parties to have input and neutral arbiters to decide what, you know, a reasonable set of district lines are. And it is worth noting that right now, because the states where these rules, these nonpartisan processes or bipartisan processes are being put into place are largely heavily Democratic leaning states, it actually means that Democrats are probably leaving a few seats on the table, if you will, right? They're actually compromising themselves a little bit. But this has become such an intense problem, not just because of the technology, but because of the increasing association of where you live and who you vote for. And in particular, the increasing association of rural America and rural places with the Republican Party. Because it turns out, as a lot of researchers have shown, Jonathan Rodden at Stanford is one of them, it's a lot easier to draw districts that cram urban voters together, right? They're already densely packed. And so there is a natural bias in favor of the Republican Party as it's become a more rural party. But that said, you can add to that bias, and the Republicans have gained probably on the order of 15 additional House seats, which is a lot given how close the elections have been, with partisan gerrymandering at the district level, at the federal level. And the way that works is very simple, right? You pack and you crack, as they say, right? You pack the Democratic voters together, you crack voters who are not in urban centers, right, across multiple districts, the Democratic voters across multiple districts, so they can't win. And I would say two things. One is that this is really as big of a problem at the state legislative level as it is at the federal level. We don't talk as much about it, but if Republicans control state legislators, state houses and state senates, then they can do all the things that we've been talking about: gerrymandering, changing the voter laws, interfering with elections. And so Republicans have gained so-called trifectas in a lot of states in the last generation. That is, they've controlled the governor's mansion, the state house, the state senate. And importantly, they've used that power to change the rules so that they're much more likely to win the state legislature. So even when a Democrat might win the governor's mansion, we've seen this again and again, right, in the struggles over, say, Medicaid, right? Even when a Democrat wins the governor's mansion, the Democrat faces this unified Republican opposition in the state house and the state senate. And that has meant, right, that gerrymandering is compounding the problems that we're talking about. And it can be fixed, but it can only be fixed, I think, with a federal law, because this is a classic case, right, where there's a big chunk of people who actually benefit, a big chunk of partisans who benefit from the current situation. They have no incentive to change the rules in the states they control. And it's going to have to be a set of rules at the national level. And this is completely constitutional, straightforward. It's consistent with common sense and constitutional jurisprudence, that there has to be a set of standards at the national level that govern the drawing of districts at the state level.
We've only got a couple of minutes left, but I've seen polls, and I'm sure you've seen them too, that show that a lot of younger people, not just in the United States, but in other countries as well, don't have the same reverence for democracy that sort of prevailed, for example, as I was growing up. Democracy is not sacrosanct, and in some cases, it seems like youngsters, millennials, and others don't care that much about it. You're a professor up at Yale, and I wondered, do you have conversations about this with your students, and what kind of feedback are you getting?
Well, I may not have a very typical set of
they're not
younger Americans,
typical,
because I teach a big course on public policy, and we talk about this very phenomenon of democratic backsliding. And I can tell you the students are deeply interested in it and deeply worried about it. And in fact, I would say that there is a despair about democracy, but the basic ideas that animate our democracy are very popular and strong. You get extremely high levels of support for things like ensuring everyone has the right to vote, making sure that you have, don't let parties control the districting process, don't let parties control the elections. And it is true that there is an intense minority of voters who are associated with the Republican Party that are more skeptical of some of these policies, but they're very, very popular. In fact, I would just go more broadly and say that we don't really have a generational split over many of these principles and policies. We have a deep partisan split, and it's really driven by an intense minority that has outsized power in our
Right.
politics. And that's the challenge, right? Is how do you get a kind of less intense majority to be able to rule? And it strikes me that you try to reduce those things that give this intense minority power. And one of them, I wrote a book called Let Them Eat Tweets. And I have to say, things have been a lot quieter since Donald Trump has been off Twitter. So
No
we
kidding.
can't ignore the fact that social media has been used. It's been used to organize a January 6th violent insurrection. It's been used to propagate these lies about the election and to organize to pursue anti-democratic measures. The other institution that we really need to focus on revitalizing, it seems to me, is we've got to have a stronger sense of kind of shared civic bonds, and we need to build some organizations that link voters across lines of class and race that are dedicated to preserving our democracy.
So we're going to have to leave it on that note that there is hope. We can fix our democracy. We've been speaking with Dr. Jacob Hacker of Yale University. This has been a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Bob, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
And to our viewers, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.